So welcome, wherever you might be calling in. This is a briefing that we're doing at fairly short notice, obviously because events are moving quickly on the ground. And we're keen to explore as we go along the international legal aspects of this conflict. As Think, the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation, we promote the fair and the balanced application of international law in the Middle East region, and particularly in relation to Israel and its conflicts with Palestine and its neighbors. And one of the things I think are all seeing is a lot of talk about international law. There's a lot of people out there saying that Israel is using disproportionate force. We all see these buildings collapsing in Gaza, terrible images of children, men and women caught under buildings. And the perception is very much that Israel is the powerful one, Gaza are the weak ones, and whatever the rights and wrongs, Israel is going too far. What do you think, Jeff?
Well, I mean, I think we've seen this story play out before. There's this kind of David and Goliath perception that Israel has this remarkably capable military, coupled with an ability to protect itself from the indiscriminate attacks launched by Hamas or perhaps Hezbollah in the north through the Iron Dome. And therefore, it's instinctive almost to assume that the Israeli response ought to be kind of a tit-for-tat response. If one Israeli civilian gets killed, then it might be okay to do an attack that kills one Palestinian civilian. But the narrative is distorted, I think, by two primary influences. The first is the very natural instinct for the media and the public to engage in what I've called effects-based condemnations. In other words, you look at the consequences of a military attack, the effects of a military attack, and you extrapolate from that which side must be responsible for the civilian suffering. And that is very complicated, and often it's not the side that's launching the attack that bears the principal responsibility for the suffering of the civilians on the other end of the attack. And then the other distorting fact is that people just don't understand international law. They don't understand a state's legal right of self-defense, and they don't understand the way the law functions when you're conducting hostilities to provide certainly protection or mitigation of risk for the civilian population, which is a fundamental purpose of the law, but not to the point where it disables the ability of a military commander to achieve vital military objectives. And these factors kind of play into the general narrative of an overbearing side against a weaker side, and it leads to what we see in the general view, which is that this is an illegitimate action on the part of Israel.
Well, let's think for a moment about the context and perhaps the things which led up to this. Before I do that, for those of you who are participating, please submit any questions you might have through the Q&A function. We have a Q&A, and we will deal with questions at the end of this discussion in about 25 minutes time, and we do encourage you to put your questions. I mean, this Gaza thing has been obviously going on since 2005 when Israel withdrew from Gaza. In fact, Gaza's always been a problem, hasn't it? Ever since Egypt occupied it in the War of Independence and never annexed it. Egypt was never interested in having Gaza. There's a lot of people in a very small area of land. It's not landlocked, but it is stuck between Israel and Egypt. It has a coastline, but it's a very difficult bit of territory. And then Israel pulled out in 2005 under Ariel Sharon. They said, well, we don't want to occupy Gaza. We don't want to be in control. And they pulled out I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, 15,000 Israelis who were living in the Gaza Strip were forcibly removed from Gaza. And Israel said to the Palestinians, well, you can have it, you can run it. And they were met immediately with hostility. Then Hamas took over control in 2007 with its conflict with Fatah. So this is sort of an ongoing thing. And I think this is the fourth Gaza war, in a sense. Now, there have been tensions in Israel over recent months. There have been various incidents in the West Bank and elsewhere. Palestinian elections, which didn't go ahead. Abbas pulled out of the elections, which I think frustrated and annoyed a lot of Palestinians who wanted to see some fair elections for once, and they're not happy with Ramallah. Then we had an incident on the Temple Mount at the end of Ramadan, hundreds of thousands of Muslims celebrating Ramadan on the Temple Mount. And things erupted, didn't they? I think it was the 10th of May when things got out of hand and the Israeli police intervened. And then suddenly Hamas comes into the picture. Why was that? What on earth has Hamas got to do with Jerusalem or the Temple Mount?
Well, listen, first off, let's acknowledge that most of the people living in Gaza, it's a sad existence. I mean, they're living under a tyrannical kind of quasi-terror state. And remember that when Israel pulled out, I don't think they met a violent reaction immediately. Fatah was in there and the Israelis were kind of preparing for some type of quasi-normal capability to deal with Gaza. And then Hamas won the election and was literally throwing PA officials off of the top of buildings as they took over. And so one of the consistent themes of Hamas tactics is to exploit the suffering of their own population. I mean, it's pervasive. They put their military objectives in the midst of the civilian population. They tell their civilian population, if you evacuate the area, you're going to be viewed as a collaborator with the Zionists. And so what happens on the Temple Mount, look, there probably needs to be a very careful investigation of the way the Israeli police reacted to that situation. There may be culpability or dereliction on that side. It didn't seem to be a very well-handled situation, certainly from my perspective, but that in no way gave Hamas a legal authority to suddenly start indiscriminately launching weapons, rockets at Israel. But what is Hamas doing? They see this as an opportunity to raise their profile among the Palestinian population, not primarily in Gaza, because they have them in an iron grip, but in the West Bank. I mean, their goal is to push Fatah out of the control of the West Bank to advance their agenda. So it's a perfect opportunity to exploit. We're the defenders. The PA can't do anything to defend you. We can step in and stand up to the Goliath. And yeah, I mean, look at the sympathy that it evokes around the world, not just in the region. It's tragic because it serves no positive interest. Their interest, I don't think, is anything other than to advance their own agenda, not to be a legitimate defender of the innocent, if you will.
And what is that agenda, Jeff? What do we know about Hamas' agenda?
Well, I'm not an expert on everything Hamas. My expertise in the area of international humanitarian law, but we know that the whole idea of a negotiated solution to the dilemma between Israel and the Palestinians, that there's this massive roadblock called Gaza and Hamas. Their agenda is to do whatever they can to delegitimize Israel and to advance their cause, because I think they see the long game, not just 5 years, 10 years, but 100 years, where the population of Arabs in the region will basically overwhelm the Jewish population. And if they're affiliated with the kind of Islamic extreme agenda of Hamas, which is to, from the Jordan River to the sea, right? Basically have a Islamic state ruling over the entire region. That I don't see how anybody can dispute that that's what their ultimate goal is. They're not interested in a negotiated solution. And that's why it's in their interest to constantly create these cycles of violence, because it always accrues to the benefit of not reaching some type of peaceful agreement.
Jeff, there's a perception out there, I think, though, that, you know, liberation, freedom fighters have a right to use violence. Nelson Mandela used violence, and everybody adored him. And I think people see Hamas as a kind of freedom fighters for fighting to free Palestine.
Yeah.
What does international law say about their right to use force? Are they entitled to use force?
Well, the international law related to the use of military force gives a monopoly to states. I mean, only states have the authority to act in self-defense, individually or collectively, and only states have the authority through the United Nations Security Council to take enforcement measures under Chapter 7. Non-state organized armed groups may feel that they have a moral right to use force to achieve self-determination, but it's not an internationally recognized legal right. So even if we acknowledge that a group has a right to a people has a right to self-determination, they have to work within legal means to achieve that right. But let's take it one step further. If Hamas had the capability to direct its weapons at specific objectives, military objectives, however we define them, and if that's where they were directing their attacks, and it was relatively clear that they were attacking military installations, Israeli forces, command and control centers, then the argument would really be focused on whether they have a right to act to begin with. But they don't even try and follow the rules of war once they initiate action. And if there's one thing that's clear about international law, is that whether you're fighting for a state or a non-state group, your obligation to respect the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law is an equal obligation. You're not somehow released from the obligation to distinguish between civilian and military targets because you're the weaker enemy or party to the conflict, or because you think your cause is just. I mean, that would be perverse, because most states and non-state groups that engage in hostilities believe their cause is just. We'd have no rules. If you could simply say, because my cause is just, I'm absolved of the obligations of international law in the conduct of hostilities. So for me, based on my expertise, the really offensive aspect of what they do is how they do it, even more than why they're doing it.
Well, I'll come back to that, because the International Criminal Court has said the prosecutor has said she will investigate potential Hamas crimes, war crimes rising since 2014. So I want to ask you later whether you think she will, or her successor will, investigate possible crimes arising out of this conflict. But before we get there, what kind of rockets is Hamas firing? I mean, what are we talking about here, and how dangerous are they?
Well, I mean, if you look back to 2014, there were rocket volleys that were very limited, both in terms of density and capability, range, precision, et cetera. It seems relatively clear from the open source reporting that Hamas's rocket capability has increased substantially. I mean, the volume of fire itself, right, we're up to over 3,000 missile shots or rocket shots to date. The volume of fire itself is deeply troubling, and the quality seems to have been improved. The range, they're ranging further targets. All of that, there's not much mystery here of where this increased capability is coming from. It's coming from their sponsor, which is Iran, which has an interest in ensuring that there's a robust proxy capability on the northern and southern borders of Israel, which they now have. And, this all implicates this other aspect of the narrative, which is Israel really doesn't have to act aggressively in response because they can hunker down under Iron Dome and everything will be safe. But, I started my career as an intelligence officer in the Army. And I learned about the way intelligence agencies gather data related to enemy capabilities in order to come up with countermeasures. Every time Israel is compelled to activate Iron Dome, it gives an opponent the opportunity to gather information on its capabilities and start to develop tactics that will overcome those capabilities. So I don't think there's any doubt that the use of these missiles attacks is also serving the interest of Iran, that is using the intelligence they're gathering from the Israeli response in an effort to enhance their own capability, or almost equally frightening, the capability of Hezbollah in the north, because their rocket arsenal, we know, is tremendously more significant. So anything they can do to mitigate the effect of Iron Dome is a real danger for the Israelis. So there are different consequences to this ongoing, constantly having to activate the system. And the volume is very troubling, because now it seems to me, at least, that from a strategic self-defense perspective, there's a limit to what Iron Dome can do. If you have a two-front war with rocket volleys, in the hundreds per day coming from both the north and the south, I mean, at some point you're going to exhaust your resupply rate for the intercepting missiles, or more likely have to prioritize the most vital objectives in the state, which leaves the civilian population unprotected. So it's a game changer, I think. And I think that's why you see that the campaign that the IDF has been launching is trying to neuter as much as possible the capability of Hamas to resurrect this threat in the near future.
Does the international humanitarian law has the principle of proportionality? And I understand that applies both to the question of when you initiate a response and how you initiate, or whether you have a right to initiate it, as much as to the ongoing conduct of hostilities. Can you tell us a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, I think it's probably one of the most misunderstood terms in this kind of equation. So the principle of proportionality applies in two distinct contexts. The first is as an aspect of assessing the necessity of an action in self-defense, right? So when a state is the victim of an unlawful attack, it's no different than if you were in a bar and someone took a swing at you. You have a right to act in self-defense because you've been the victim of unlawful violence, but you're only allowed to do what's necessary to restore your safety. That's proportionality. If someone throws a punch at you and you pull out a gun and shoot them, you're probably going to be brought to trial for a criminal homicide because you used excessive force. Proportionality in that context means that Israel has to make a reasonable judgment that the scope of its operation, the totality of the operation, is genuinely necessary to reduce the nature of the threat it's facing. This is what I meant earlier when I said the law doesn't require a tit-for-tat response, right? You don't have to, one missile shoots, you shoot one back. No, that's not the way it works. The way it works is you assess what the gravity of the threat is, and then what do you need to do to reduce that threat? That's what we call ad bellum proportionality, or the legal right to use force proportionality. Once you are engaged in hostilities, then there's a different aspect of proportionality, and that's the proportionality rule that's designed to mitigate the collateral and incidental risk to civilians when you're attacking a lawful target. So if I find an enemy target, let's say I find a missile launch site in a deserted area in Gaza, and there are no civilians around, when I attack that target, I don't have to consider proportionality, because proportionality in the conduct of hostilities does not protect the deliberate object of your attack. What it protects is the people and things that are proximate to that target, and it protects them from indiscriminate effect. So the law actually doesn't use the word proportional. The law says when a military commander is preparing to launch an attack, and he or she knows that the attack will, or anticipates the attack will result in civilian casualties or destruction of civilian property, he has to make a judgment that the value of the target is significant enough so that the anticipated civilian harm will not be excessive, not disproportionate, excessive. And interestingly, in the statute for the International Criminal Court, to transform that to a criminal offense, you have to make a finding that the civilian risk was clearly excessive. So it's an even heightened standard. So what this means in practice is relatively simple. If you have a party to a conflict that's deliberately shooting its missiles at civilians, proportionality is not even an issue. That's just a violation of the obligation to distinguish between military targets and civilian targets. If you see attacks against what appear to be military objectives that cause a lot of damage to civilian property, like bringing down a building. So let's say there's a command post in the basement and you bring down the entire building. It's very easy to say, wow, look at that amount of damage. That must have been disproportionate. But unless you know what the target was, unless you know the value that the commander assessed in destroying that target, it's like saying 1 plus I don't know equals 5. You've got to know both. And it's kind of ironic for me that the idea of investigating Hamas war crimes. Good luck. Good luck for the OTP, the Office of the Prosecutor, to get access to the targeting decision equations of Hamas commanders. And without that, you're just speculating. So I don't want to mislead people. The effects of combat are certainly probative of compliance with the law, but they are rarely dispositive. They're circumstantial evidence of whether there was compliance or non-compliance, but you need to know the full equation. You need to know why you were attacking, why you used that weapon, why you did it at that time, in order to make an assessment of whether the proportionality judgment was credible.
So we have a sort of a situation where Israel, my understanding is the IDF goes to great pains to, at every point, every decision that's made, to make that judgment, to make that assessment. Can you tell us a little bit about how the IDF works in that way?
Well, I've had a lot of interaction with what's called the Military Advocate General's Office, and specifically the International Law Division of the Military Advocate General's Office. And they are some of the most talented experts in international humanitarian law I've ever encountered. And that's saying a lot, because I think that, you know, in the British military, the Dutch military, the US military, Canadian, there are great experts in this field. They understand that a tactical victory can very quickly turn into a strategic disaster based not only on actual violation of the law, but perceived violation of the law. So there's been I think, substantial increase in the appreciation among Israeli military commanders of the importance of the principle of legitimacy, right? That you're always going to have people that are going to condemn you, but when the dust settles from a conflict, you better be prepared to demonstrate your commitment to the principles of international humanitarian law, to explain why you attack certain targets. If you go on the IDF Military Advocate General's website, they put a lot of information out there now, information that would never have been put out 15 or 20 years ago. Targeting data, images, videos. They're trying to demonstrate that what we're attacking are in fact military targets, and we are taking measures to mitigate the risk. And that begins early in the process, training and weapons development. So the precision of the attacks, right, is troubling from an objective standpoint, because we're all seeing the consequence of this violent combat action. But the precision is, in military terms, relatively remarkable, that you're not doing artillery barrages into populated areas. And their pre-attack warning system is kind of unprecedented. Now, they have the ability to do things that we couldn't do. For example, if we were fighting in Iraq, they have the phone numbers and emails of the entire population, and they send out text messages and get out and get away. Even the building that housed the journalists. I mean, the immediate reaction was the IDF is deliberately attacking journalists. Well, if that were the case, why would you give a warning to get out? So, and every time they give a warning, they compromise to a certain extent their military advantage, because the warning is also being heard by the enemy. But that's a price they're willing to pay. They've made the calculation that it's worth it to do what we can to mitigate the risk to the civilian population, which perversely has been exacerbated by Hamas's tactics of co-locating its vital military objectives in the midst of the civilian population. So one side's trying to mitigate risk, the other side's trying to exacerbate risk. And the side that's trying to mitigate is condemned because it's easy to look at the effects of an attack and say, you must be the evil party.
How public is that information, or how well known? Because I mean, I hear it said a lot, you know, Hamas embeds its military operations in civilian schools and hospitals and so forth. But is that really the case? Is that, are they deliberately doing that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's no doubt whatsoever, as in the north with Hezbollah. I mean, the houses in southern Lebanon, many of them are fighting positions or missile launch sites, and the IDF knows this. Now, this goes back to your point about, well, if you're a freedom fighter, you should be forgiven. You have to do things a certain way. So there's this tendency to say, yeah, okay, maybe they shouldn't put their command post in a hospital, but hey, they're fighting the Israelis. They got to do something to mitigate the strength of the Israeli military. Well, I mean, that's a choice they make, but let's be honest, that means that they are probably more culpable for the inevitable civilian risk than the party launching the attack. This is the great dilemma for military commanders today. I mean, they could forego the attack because they know there are civilians there, in which case the enemy gains the advantage of not being attacked, or they can launch the attack knowing they're going to cause civilian casualties, in which case the enemy gets a strategic information advantage. When I did a report on the 2014 conflict with 5 retired American generals, one of them hit the nail on the head. His name is Tony Jones. He was a retired 2-star general. And he said, when I started my career as a tank officer, information was a supporting effort to combat. What I've learned about Hamas is that for them, combat is a supporting effort for information. They don't care what the consequences are of the battle. All they want to do is come out standing, because the inevitable civilian casualties and destruction will give them the strategic information advantage in the public domain. And that's what they're really after.
Right.
So if you're the IDF, you're walking a tightrope between trying to achieve your military objective, but do it in a way that doesn't create such a perception of illegitimacy that you win the battle and lose the war.
Well, Israel's certainly losing the perception war, aren't they? I think out in the general media, and they'll never win that, probably.
That's right.
How far could Israel go, do you think, in your view? I mean, this is the choice I think they have to make. I know they're being pressured to enter into a ceasefire, and there'll be temptations to do that. But on the other hand, this is going to keep bouncing back at them, isn't it, this Gaza thing? How far can they go to really destroy Hamas capability?
Well, I mean, in my opinion, and it's all it is, if I were a legal advisor on the National Security Council in Israel and I were asked, what could we do? Having endured this threat now multiple times, knowing that the northern border has a substantially more robust missile threat directed at us, I would say as a matter of self-defense, you could go in and wipe out Hamas. You could root them out and destroy their capability. But that gets to the old saying that sometimes something can be lawful and still be awful, or just because it's legal doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And I think we see that in the approach to this campaign, that the Israelis really don't have an interest in reoccupying Gaza. With that, I mean, that's what it would amount to. And also, as you and I were speaking about before we started, what would fill that vacuum when they left? I mean, that's another problem. Sometimes the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And you could end up with a more radical regime in Gaza. ISIS could see it as an opportunity to fill a vacuum. And so I think what the IDF does is they say they get their strategic mission, which is to, as best you can, disable or dismantle the Hamas capability to attack the territory of Israel. And that means basically three things: weapons, storage and launch facilities, command and control, and communications, and tunnels. And I think that since 2014, the Israelis have known that the next time this happens, we need capabilities that give us the space to forego the ground assault option. So if you notice in the news, you hear a lot about the Israelis are taking out tunnels. They're doing it from the air.
Yeah, amazing.
Remember back in 2014, they didn't have that capability. What they were doing, you probably remember, they even had to put working dogs into the tunnels with GoPro cameras to figure out what was in there. They were caught off guard. So again, if you think about the obligation of international law to seek measures that mitigate civilian risk, all of that R&D and weapons and tactics capability development that's occurred in the last 7 years has actually accrued to the benefit of the civilian population of Gaza, because it's giving Israel the opportunity to achieve its operational objectives without having to put in a major ground force like they did in 2014. But of course, there's no credit for that, right? It's just a given. And what happens is they drop a bomb to blow up a tunnel. The opening is right in a civilian community. Civilians are injured and killed. And, obviously that must be terrible. What's the alternative if you're defending yourself?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Jeff, there was a report here in the newspaper. I don't know, I'm sure you probably saw it. There was a building which was bombed and collapsed, killing a number of people. And according to these journalists, there was absolutely no military objective whatsoever. This was just a domestic. Now, is that necessarily a war crime? Is it, if a building is targeted and it proves that there was no military installation, does that 1 + 1 equal a war crime, or is there more to the picture?
No, I think it's probative of a war crime. It's evidence that we have to look very carefully at why this building was targeted. But the test for a lawful targeting decision is not an after the fact, post hoc, were you right test. The question is, at the time the attack was launched, did the authorizing commander make a reasonable judgment that it was a military objective and that the value of the target was not substantially outweighed by the risk to the civilian population, and that he did what he could that was feasible to mitigate civilian risk, like give a warning or select a certain weapon. So it's no different than the debate over policing, right? The law doesn't require that a commander always be right. What the law demands of a commander is that he be reasonable. And reasonable is an objective standard. So what I would say, if I were the JAG doing the investigation, if the commander was ignoring intelligence that suggested the enemy had moved its equipment out of the building and said, I don't want to hear that, I saw the report from last week, that's a military objective, then that would be evidence of a war crime, because you would say your judgment was, under the circumstances, was not reasonable. But look, this, I remember back in the first Gulf War, when the United States had evidence of a command and control center in Baghdad, and they launched an attack, and without us knowing it, the Iraqis had used the basement as a fallout shelter for families of the high-level officials, women and children. And so it was all over CNN that the United States bombed this fallout shelter. But again, the question is not what the result was. The question was there an unreasonable judgment related to the attack? Now, what I will say is this, that the quality of Israeli intelligence and their capability to assess targets is a relevant consideration in that assessment, right? So the argument that I made a reasonable mistake gets harder and harder the better you've demonstrated your ability not to make mistakes.
Okay, thanks. Jeff, we're going to move to some questions.
Okay.
Mateus asks, to who does the Gaza Strip belong according to international law? Israeli Supreme Court says that all of the pre-67 land is belligerently occupied by Israel. How should I respond to a discussion on this point?
Can you feel that one, Ed?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's a good question, Mateus. I think they're two very different things, whether or not territory is occupied and the question of to whom does it belong. They're actually two separate legal issues. The status of the Gaza Strip is disputed. Israel could have, when Israel took back territory in 1967, it was taking territory that had never been decided whether it was part of the state of Israel or not, because Israel had been immediately attacked in 1948 by the Arabs. So there was an argument already immediately in 67 about whether Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza belonged to Israel. Now, since then, Israel has clearly distanced itself from Gaza, and I think it would be very hard to argue that Gaza is part of the state of Israel. But it's not really part of the state of anybody. It's not part of a state at all. It's a territory which is in a complete limbo, really. It's not part of Egypt. It's not part of Israel. It's not part of a state of Palestine because Palestine does not exist as a state. So many lawyers say, well, the only fallback is to apply the regime of international law of belligerent occupation, which is to say, at least it's a body of law that protects, a humanitarian law that protects civilians. And therefore it should apply to Gaza. Now, that doesn't say anything about the territorial status of Gaza. It simply says if there's an occupying power, that occupying power has a responsibility to look after the civilians. Now, this is tricky because Israel says, well, we're not an occupying power anymore. We moved out of Gaza in 2005. And if anybody's in control of Gaza, it's Hamas. So you can't expect Israel to look after the Palestinian population of Israel. And I think personally there's a lot to be said for that. Unfortunately, the many international lawyers, including the Red Cross, say, well, the fact that Israel has a kind of blockade, that it controls the borders, means it is in a way in control of Gaza. Therefore, it's an occupying power. It's a difficult discussion, but it's a separate discussion from the law that Jeff is talking about of humanitarian law applying to armed conflict and the use of force in an armed conflict. The answer to your question, if you want to speak to people about Gaza, you say, well, I think you have to say it's undetermined, the status of Gaza. And Hamas has responsibilities as a governing authority, albeit de facto, in the Gaza Strip, I would say. Jeff, would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I mean, I think we could all pretty quickly agree that if Fatah regained governing control over Gaza, then it would be treated as part of the inevitable or nascent Palestinian state. Certainly the Egyptians never want it back.
Right.
The Israelis don't want it back. I agree with you on the occupation issue. I actually think the argument that Israel is an occupying power is pretty feeble. The whole idea of the law of occupation is that the military basically assumes the function of governing an area that's been taken over, and therefore they have certain obligations to the people, and the people have obligations to the military. The Israelis have no governing authority whatsoever. I mean, if they were an occupying power, they'd be arresting any Hamas militant who poses a security threat to Israel.
Yeah.
So, and ironically also, we say, well, they don't have any responsibility for the people of Gaza. They nonetheless still support the people with a lot of the energy, a lot of the power that runs to Gaza comes from Israel. And even at the border crossing, there's this remarkable neutral zone where, the Israeli, if they, once they've cleared materials to go into Gaza, Israeli workers bring it into the neutral zone, they go out, and then the Palestinians come in and take it out. This is happening in the midst of conflict. I mean, again, there's no other conflict like this. You can't even imagine another country that's threatened by an entity on its border that is creating this mechanism where supplies and resources that can be transported across the border during that period of time. But no one talks about those.
Yeah. Chaim asks, Professor Court has stressed that Hamas has its own best interest in this exercise to be seen as a defender of Jerusalem, to gain popularity with Palestinians, etc. Thomas Friedman in the New York Times has written, the Prime Minister Netanyahu has similar personal and political objectives to forestall the establishment of an anti-Netanyahu government, which would include Israeli Arab representatives. What are your thoughts about this?
I mean, again, this is more of my personal opinion, not so much as a legal expert. I think Friedman's right. I think that it's hard to ignore the fact that this flare-up that has cost lives and made people miserable on both sides to a degree that most people could never even contemplate. I think it's accrued to the benefit of both Hamas and to Netanyahu. I mean, the idea, my understanding is there's already been a slight shift in one of the far right parties that said they wouldn't join a coalition with him, may have shifted. And if he ends up creating another government out of this, I think there is, if I were an Israeli, I would be deeply skeptical. And it would be more focused not so much on the self-defense response, but on the events that triggered it, as Andrew started with, the military and police response to what happened in the Noble Sanctuary and so on and so forth. I think people should be skeptical about whether some of that was calculated to, enhance his position. And if that's true, that's utterly tragic and disgraceful. I mean, war, it's never the prime minister who goes to war or the head of Hamas who goes to war. It's the soldiers and the operatives and the civilians who suffer under the rain of weapons. And it should be something that should be avoided at all costs. And if it turns out that this was something that was sought, that's deeply troubling. I don't know what your thoughts are, Andrew.
Yeah, I don't know enough about it. I mean, there is obviously, it is a very remarkable timing, all of this. You had this sort of coalescence of, the Palestinian elections which didn't go through. You have this unbelievably hopeless coalition discussions in Israel. Netanyahu is clearly trying to hang on to power. And there have been many allegations, haven't there, in the past of him sort of using these kinds of incidents. But what troubles me a little bit is some people automatically make the allegation that Israel is always looking for an opportunity to provoke a conflict with Gaza. So even separate from Netanyahu and his personal, I see that quite a lot out there that, oh yeah, here we go again. Israel is just using this again to beat Hamas over the head. And I find that a little bit troubling.
I find it absurd. I mean, I think most Israelis have come to be comfortable with the status quo, where there's this kind of low-level tension, but they can live their lives normally, and the economy is working, and they're coming out of COVID, and all these things.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea that there would be a general appetite for triggering another conflict like this, I think, is wrong. And again, it may turn out that the decisions of the Israeli leadership and police authorities deserve substantial criticism, but I don't see how that justifies starting to launch rockets indiscriminately at the civilian population of Israel.
Right. Okay, next question. Matos asks, from the perspective of violation of humanitarian law, is it possible to switch off the electricity and water supply to the Gaza Strip? Or is this also a violation of humanitarian law because it would affect the civilians of Gaza?
Yeah, I think certainly switching off the water would be deeply troubling. I mean, you can use, what you're talking about is siege tactics, right? If you have an enemy in a fort and you can cut off their water, you're allowed to do that because the only victims of that are the enemy soldiers. But you're not allowed to use those type of starvation tactics, so to speak, against the civilian population. And the other problem with it is one of the rules of war is a prohibition on using indiscriminate weapons, not just attacks, but weapons. And how do you target the cutoff of water or the cutoff of electricity to only affect your enemy? You can't do it. It's like releasing gas once you or chemical weapon. Once you release it, you can't control its effects. You know, the news of Hamas launching fire balloons across the border. I mean, you can't, when I saw that, I thought, I can't even imagine a more ideal example of an indiscriminate weapon. You can't control where it goes. You can't control where it lands. And once you release the agent, you can't control what it's going to destroy. I mean, it's the essence of an indiscriminate weapon. So I think that the Israelis wouldn't, I don't think that would be something that they would contemplate because they know they can't mitigate the effect on the civilian population by doing that.
Would Israel, do you think, ever contemplate reoccupying Gaza or re-entering Gaza?
Certainly re-entering, right, for what we might call a substantial raid, right? You get in, you achieve your military objective, you get out. Would Israel contemplate reoccupying? I don't know. My guess is there probably is a war plan somewhere to reoccupy Gaza, but I think it's probably pretty close to a measure of last resort because that type of occupation with a hostile population is incredibly difficult. And again, you know, part of this we can't forget is that there is a battle for legitimacy. And you're right, Andrew. I think most people are going to be unaffected. But Israel knows there are people on the margin, right? Even people like leaders of other democratic states. And you don't want to push them to a position where they feel compelled to come out in condemnation. So a full-scale invasion with reoccupation, the perception of illegitimacy, even if you could justify it, which I think you might be able to as a measure of self-defense, the perception of illegitimacy would be so substantial that it wouldn't be worth the cost if there's any way possible to avoid it.
Right. Hugh has a question about the sovereignty of Gaza. It has been suggested that Israel has arguably abandoned Gaza, therefore may no longer have a claim to sovereignty. Is this something we should be discussing? I'm not sure if it's really relevant to this issue, is it, Jeff?
No, I don't think Israel has any interest in reclaiming or claiming Gaza. They don't want it.
No. Yeah.
I mean, let's be honest, they have enough trouble dealing with claims of sovereignty on the West Bank. So why would you want to add that? What do you get out of that?
Well, yeah. I'm not sure, except yeah. Perhaps let's not go down that track. Chaim has another question, and we're going to bring things to a close because we're running out of time. Chaim asks, what would going in achieve at this point? Israel is managing perfectly from the air, especially after the destruction of the tunnels. I mean, that's a good question.
Well, I mean, listen, we assume Israel is managing perfectly from the air. What happens in a campaign is that the military commander is given a strategic mission, and then he comes up with what are basically the mission essential tasks. And we shouldn't be surprised that Israel the public statement is we're managing fine from the air. We don't know behind the scenes if there are certain objectives that the commander has told the National Security Council and the Prime Minister. We really are only able to achieve these objectives with a ground raid. At that point, the political leaders have to make the strategic decision. Are those objectives so important that it's worth putting troops on the ground? And to date, the answer has been no. So when we say Israel is managing fine from the air, I think it would be more accurate to say the Israeli leadership is satisfied that what they're achieving through air attacks is sufficient to achieve their objective generally. I don't know whether or not there are objectives that could only be achieved through a ground incursion, but if they choose not to do it, that's the type of strategic decisions that civilian leaders of the military have to make.
Yeah. Okay. Second last question. The problem of distinguishing between military and civilians. This is a difficulty in Gaza where, first of all, they're not dressed in uniforms, so you can't tell from the outside who's a military operative and who's not. How does Israel make that kind of judgment? What is their intelligence like?
Well, I mean, I don't know the details of their intelligence. If I did, I probably would be in jail somewhere in Israel because I don't have access to their sources and methods. But I think that over the years, they have become very adept at figuring out who's who, where the military objectives are located, and how to try and strike them in a way that mitigates to the greatest extent feasible civilian risk. I will tell you this, I recently published an article titled Beyond Human Shielding, Indirect Targeting of Civilians. I actually think that there needs to be some thought on whether the use of civilians as shields, that's a war crime. Using a civilian as a human shield is a war crime. But I think when you're doing it to bait the other side into attacking, to kill those civilians, then you should treat the use of those human shields almost as murder of those civilians. You're using, in my view, Hamas frequently uses the Israeli military as what criminal law calls an innocent instrumentality. In other words, they use them as their agent to kill their own civilians so they can create a media advantage out of it. And the point of this article is that I think that's more aggravated than just human shielding. Human shielding is pretty bad. You're trying to prevent the enemy from attacking your target. But I think in many cases, Hamas wants Israel to attack the target so they get the information advantage of dead and injured civilians. And to me, that's a more aggravated violation of the law and should be characterized that way.
Okay, so now you're talking war crimes, which leads me to my last question. That's about the International Criminal Court. If anybody's going to bring a measure of justice or accountability to this, it's the ICC in The Hague. They have an investigation. They have jurisdiction, they say, over Gaza and the West Bank to look at war crimes committed by anybody. How do you assess the likelihood that the prosecutor will really seriously investigate and potentially prosecute Hamas leaders for these kinds of war crimes? I mean, what can we expect of the ICC?
Well, I mean, and you and I have interacted a good bit on this issue. I think that the ICC itself, especially the Office of the Prosecutor, is always concerned about legitimacy in the eyes of the state parties. If the only object of their prosecutorial efforts ends up being Israelis, it's going to, I think, delegitimize the entire process. It's like the statement that the UN Human Rights Council put out, where they said Israel is engaging in indiscriminate attacks, which is a war crime. And then it says Hamas is likely violating the laws and the law of war or humanitarian law. I mean, that just shows such a palpable bias. How can you say Hamas is likely violating humanitarian law in the same document where you conclude Israel is engaged in indiscriminate attacks when you don't even know what the nature of the target was. So I think the ICC prosecutor is going to have to, if they, particularly on conduct of hostilities issues. I'm not talking about the treatment of the Palestinians and the territories that the ICC prosecutor says are occupied, settlements, those type of things. If they're going to go after Israeli personnel for conduct of hostilities violations, indiscriminate attacks, targeting civilians, etc., and they don't open an investigation on Hamas leadership, how is that in any way credible? There's nothing even close to a lawful attack from the Hamas side when they just fire missiles and their statement is, well, we aim as best we can in the direction of Israel. Now, the problem they're going to have is how do you investigate that when you've got an organization that you're not going to get access to anything?
Well, this is the risk, isn't it? That they will, because Israel is an open, transparent country, they'll have access to information there that they won't have in the Gaza Strip. And so you'll get potentially investigation of Israelis and they'll say, well, Hamas refused to cooperate, so our hands are tied.
I think that's a very real possibility, but it's going to, you're going to have to scratch your head and say, how can you be investigating, whether destroying this building was a war crime when you're not investigating whether firing 3,000 missiles without a target is a war crime? I mean, it will undermine, I think, the credibility. So what do you think? There's a possibility that maybe they confine it to those occupation type issues. I don't know.
Yeah, we'll see. There's going to be plenty more to talk about, Jeff. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank everybody for participating. And Jeff, we look forward to speaking to you another time, I'm sure, in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, everybody. That's the end of our session. Bye-bye.